Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. So today what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about why leg cramps are potentially a very real consequence of low back dysfunction. And I think it's a really interesting topic of conversation because for a long time we've tended to reason away leg cramps based on a few very broad factors. So some of the common things we tend to link to increasing your risk of leg cramps are things like dehydration, low in electrolytes, deconditioning, heat. There's a lot of different things that we sort of label as being the cause of leg cramps. But I think there's a really strong reason as to why we haven't necessarily solved leg cramping, or we're not necessarily at a point where we can say, look, we know how to control them and stop them from happening. But potentially with this new information, we can figure this out a lot easier. So I think it's a really interesting topic of conversation for that reason, because one of the defining features of leg cramps for me as a clinician and what I see day to day, even as an athlete or someone who likes to be athletic, and if you're watching this at home and you suffer from leg cramps, you'll hopefully agree with me here, is that leg cramps generally tend to be one-sided. So if you're calf cramps, it's generally one calf compared to the other. It's not often the same muscle on both sides. Now, if it is, we still tend to see a difference where one side's probably a little bit worse than the other, or it feels like it's a worse cramp than the other side. Now, what's really important about this is the broader explanations that we have at the moment, as I said, are broad. So if you are low in electrolytes, or you're dehydrated, for example, or it's hot, that doesn't just affect one specific muscle. It doesn't explain why a right calf can cramp and a left calf doesn't. It doesn't explain why the calf itself cramps and not the hamstring or the quad or the big toe muscles, or why every muscle doesn't sort of cramp at the same time. So I think for a long time we've had some really good thinking that's made perfect sense, where those features are there and they tend to be associated with cramping, but we haven't necessarily taken a step back and looked a little bit deeper, even broader, I guess, to say, look, there has to be a reason that explains why specific things cramp and not others. So when we sort of look at this clinically, one of the things that really opened my eyes to cramping being potentially back related is that we see a lot of cramping happen with end stage back pain patients. So if they have disc bulges, if they have really strong arthritis where the joints have worn down, that foramen where the nerve comes out gets a little bit less, so it can irritate the nerve or compress the nerve root. And one of the consequences of that are cramps. We see really sort of uncomfortable, sharp jolts of cramping that happen in calves and hamstrings or wherever that nerve connects. And for some reason, we haven't connected these two spaces together, where we sort of look at cramping as more of an athletic thing, but then when it's associated with low back pain, it makes perfect sense. So there's actually a middle ground where you don't have to have horrible end stage back complaints to have cramps. You just need lower back dysfunction. And the thing that I've found, or the thing that we find that explains why a particular muscle cramps compared to others and why it's one side more than the other, is that when you come back and look at and assess the state of someone's low back, there's often asymmetrical features that could explain that. So again, we're not talking about heavy disc bulges or arthritis or stenosis or nerve root compression. We're talking about dysfunction, so overloaded tissue that's unhappy, stiff joints, tight muscles, things that irritate or annoy that nerve in a more local level. So I guess the way that I explain this to my patients is that if you can imagine there's some lower back dysfunction there, and it's sort of creating an overfiring of the nerve. So if the function of that area isn't good enough and that nerve gets threatened or gets irritated in some way, it can send a sudden jolt of information to the area that it supplies, and you get that spasm. So one of the things I think is really important to note here is that clearly things like dehydration, electrolytes, nutrition, all the things that we currently associate with cramping clearly still have a role to play. But clinically, I think it's less of a cause and more of something that makes it more likely to happen. So if you have someone who has some back dysfunction who isn't dehydrated versus someone who is dehydrated, you might find that the person who is dehydrated is more likely to experience cramps than someone who is well hydrated. That systemic change lowers the threshold for these sorts of things to happen. But you've got to have that specific spinal, low-grade dysfunction, admittedly, to ask that tissue to cramp. So if we're just stretching calves, if we're just trying to get them stronger, if we're smashing gel packs, hydrating, conditioning, all that sort of stuff, we might be able to increase the buffer or the threshold against a cramp. But unless we start to improve the function and the way that that low back is being used, then potentially we're not curing it, we're not solving the problem. And I think one of the things that I found a lot working back home in Australia with some good athletes is that, and it's a really interesting point of conversation here, I think most would agree that we see a lot of people, or we see increased rates of cramping at the beginning of a season or during pre-season. And again, we often put that down in Australia, the weather's hotter, you're not as conditioned, all those sorts of things. It's easy to be dehydrated, and we see that start to decrease as the season wears on. And it makes sense that maybe they start to get stronger and fitter and more adapted to the things that they're doing, so those tissues are less likely to cramp. And that's probably true to a degree. But I think the biggest thing about this conversation is that the onset of a lot of those cramping episodes definitely coincide with the start or the reintroduction of a certain activity, but it also overlaps with the end of a period of inactivity for a lot of people. So the off season for a lot of people often involves a lot more sitting, a lot less sort of structured, routine activity. And for that low back dysfunction to be created, in my experiences, it often comes back to sitting postures and sitting shapes. So if you're someone who has been sitting a lot, whether you're studying in the off season, whether you're working a lot more, whether you're traveling, and you find yourself cramping more, it's very likely that you're coinciding with some long-term, less than ideal spinal shapes. And you're sort of sinking through that spine, creating an extra load through that spine over time. And then you want to use that whole area to be athletic, and it doesn't tolerate that. So I think it's a really important thing, an important distinction to make, that if you are someone who cramps a lot and you can't quite figure out why that happens, I'd urge you to have a look at your lower back and go looking for some tightness and some stiffness and some tenderness, getting rid of that, improving the way that you load that up by making sure that you take a step back, as we talk about all the time in these videos, and asking yourself, what position are you putting that part of your back in consistently throughout the day? And everything has to happen for a reason. So there's every chance that there's a position that you're getting into, either it's on the couch, sitting up in bed, watching TV, driving, whatever it is. There's a common theme there throughout your day where that section of your back is getting overloaded. And you take that overloaded tissue into something awesome, something active, and it sets off this chain reaction of events that coincide with the area that's become dysfunctional. And again, I don't want it to sound like your back's terrible, but there's every chance that it's less than perfect. And by improving that, you should start to see that those cramps don't come back. And you can be dehydrated, which is normal, unfortunately. You can be low in electrolytes, which is also normal. It can be hot, which is also normal. It's also normal to not be conditioned to an activity. There's all these things that we're blaming for cramping when you could mount an argument that they're also normal. So in a perfect world, normal things shouldn't create dysfunction. The body should be well adapted to handle that. But what we find is that the abnormal things tend to come back to the inactivity, the sitting postures, the spinal shapes, that just create a wave of dysfunction that sort of end up with something cramping. So we want to treat the local dysfunction, but we also need to make sure we're having an intelligent conversation about what's happening at your spine, because if we don't, as I said before, we can't fix it. So moving on then, what we want to make sure that we go through is we just want to show you how to improve your spinal health. Now, we'll just go through one quick exercise. It's very, very simple. You can use a foam roller, you can use a tennis ball or lacrosse ball, you can use anything that you want to. And we're going to try and go after, and if you're doing this at home, you want to locate where that dysfunction is first, and then we want to go after it and try and get it to free up. So very, very simple. All we're going to do is roll on a roller. We're going to lie back on a roller, sorry. So the key is we don't want to roll around, because we're trying to influence individual spinal levels. So by rolling around, we're really glossing over the top of them. We want to spend some time on a joint or on some tissue to get it to free up and move. So as a rule of thumb, if your calf cramps, if your hamstring cramps, we do want to look right at the base of your spine. So you can come down to the top of your hip bone. So for me, I'm going to roll backwards here, lift my bottom up. I'm going to move it around until I feel something that feels a little bit tight or a little bit different. Now, as always, if you roll your body a little bit to one side, just to bias one side of the spine, check out the joints, the tissue there, then roll back across and bias the other side.
you should find that one side feels less normal than the other. One side will feel stiffer, tighter, maybe tender. We want to prioritize the side that feels restricted. And if you're lucky, it might feel a little bit tender, and that's actually a really good sign because it's showing you that that area isn't happy. You're 100% happy. Doesn't mean it's unhappy and painful, but it means that it's less than perfect. So again, once we've found a spot, so for me it's this side, so I'm just going to angle my body a little bit, and I'm just going to stay here. I'm going to get my phone out, I'm going to watch some TV, I'm going to spend enough time here so that these tissues feel like they start to give and start to normalize, and free up, more importantly. Once I've done that, I then want to move the roller up a little bit higher and do the same thing again. And just as a quick hack, generally the stiffness and the dysfunction is going to be on the same side until you get to about the base of your rib cage where it can switch and then go up the other side. It doesn't tend to switch from segment to segment, from side to side. It's generally a theme of stiffness on one side, whereas the other side is less affected. Now, the interesting thing about all this, and again, if you've been following these videos, you'll know what's coming here, is that if your calf on this side tends to cramp a lot, it doesn't always mean that this side of your spine is the side that's overloaded and dysfunctional. Yes, it's the nerve that's getting annoyed, but it could also be the other side. So as we like to show, your body doesn't necessarily think in terms of left and right, it thinks in terms of a whole. So if I was to, so this is my left-hand side here, if I was to bunch up this left-hand side of my shirt, yes, it's most affected here, but it pulls slack from above, from up here, and it also pulls slack from the other side. Yes, there's a spine down the middle, but there's all these connections that link both sides. So the point of this conversation is, if you're on the roller and you've sort of rotated to one side and it feels really stiff, even though the other side's the side where you get your cramping symptoms, you actually want to follow that stiffness and tightness. So you might actually end up spending most of your time freeing up the spots on the opposite side because they're stiffer and tighter, not necessarily because they're painful or because they're on the same side that you're having your cramps. So it's a really important distinction because we're always going to make sure that we're thinking about fixing the broader mechanics. And if there's an anchor in one area, it can affect anything that's around that. So you can treat all the symptoms as they pop up, but until you free up and improve the function of that rusty cog or that rusty hinge, we can't cure it, we can't fix it. So that's a handy little hint. Go looking for where the stiffness and the tightness is. Don't just be seduced by which side it is. Just think of yourself as one connected organism, again, which connects up to your calf or your hamstring or your quads, depending on where that is. So generally, as you work up the spine, so as you keep working up towards the base of your rib cage and a little bit higher, any of those sections can have a role to play in your cramping, depending on where it is. So, but the key point is that you want to go looking for that yourself. And as we always do, you want to do a test and a retest. So if you consistently cramp, then make sure that you free up your back to the point where it feels looser, and then go out and do what makes you cramp, and then see over time how that changes. And what you should expect is, as that spinal function improves, almost regardless of your hydration and the temperature and all those sorts of things, you should find that you can regain control over those cramps, take away the mystery, and hopefully stop them from coming back. So hopefully that was informative. It's something that I think isn't really well known at the moment. Clinically, hindsight's fantastic. Someone who comes in with cramps, it's very, very easy to find out where the source of their cramps are by feeling around and treating their spine. So you can do the same thing with a roller or a ball as well. You don't have to take my word for it. You can just go out and do it, and then hopefully see those results as well. So if you're giving it a go, or you've given it a go, let us know in the comments below. I really want to know how it's going for you guys. Let me know how it's working. If you need some more specific guidance, I guess, let us know in the comments. If you found this really useful and really interesting, then please consider leaving a like below. And if you're new to the channel, obviously subscribe if you are, because then it just helps these videos reach more people. The more interaction we get, the more likely these videos are to pop up on other people's timelines. So, and that's obviously the goal, to reach as many people with this information as possible, because it's really useful information and it's very actionable as well. So as always, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.